I've been waiting for this episode for nearly 3 years now, and I'm really excited to show all of you my new daily driver that will finally be replacing the venerable Galaxy Note 2. In the process, you'll see the definitive review of the Moto X in complete and precise detail, as is the custom here on the channel, covering everything that one could possibly ever want to know about the device and how it measures up. Now, since my contract isn't up until March, I won't actually be able to accurately test the battery life and wireless performance in proper detail until then, but that's actually an okay thing because part 1 will be long enough the way it is, and by splitting it into 2 parts, you, the audience, will have something to look forward to as much as I will. So, without any further rambling, here's part 1 of the full and complete review of the Motorola Moto X Pure Edition. Let's take a look.
I'll pick this up and check this out.
The very first thing one might notice about the Pure Edition is that it's a very tall device. Like with any stock photo and canned review video seen online, the impression is given that the device is smaller than it really is. In this case, my expectations weren't actually that far off, given that I had looked up the dimensions of the phone relative to that of my current device, the Note 2, before purchasing. The other thing that surprised me was that the funky looking design actually appears a heck of a lot nicer in person than it does in pictures, for whatever reason. I was actually originally put off by the X's seemingly bland design, but I've got to say this is actually a nice look for it. Maybe not as eye-catching as the LG G3 or the original HTC One, but still surprisingly attractive. Here's the deal though. By this point in the Lenovo corruption of Motorola, the Moto X started to become more of a spec stunt and lose sight of its original vision as an ergonomic, practical, and inexpensive smartphone. But the interesting thing is that part of this is actually a good thing as much as it is a bad thing. And with a bit of history under the Pure Edition's wheels, I can now safely say that this is Motorola's last truly nice, all-around phone and easily my nominee for Mobile Device of the Year. Like almost all newer Android smartphones, the processors and memory are more than adequate, but they are burdened down by one of the device's calls to attention: its ridiculous 2K display. Now don't get me wrong, I don't want to be that person who waves the caution flag in front of the way of progress. There was a time when the screens on mobile devices did leave a bit to be desired, but those days are long past. Having 1440 by 2560 on a smartphone is just a complete waste. I mean, you can't even see that much detail on a screen this small with a magnifying glass, and I'm talking literally. Now, Android can cope with all kinds of screen densities, but one thing it cannot do is create detail where none exists in the first place. This means that images and videos on websites, fixed graphics in applications, and iconography that hasn't been drawn in high resolution all have to be zoomed in. But a zoomed image never looks as good as a natively rendered one, so there's a lot of opportunity for subpar graphics. That said, a lot of web pages, applications, and even visual elements inside of Android are now rendered as fonts by the device itself, which means that they can be scaled almost indefinitely without artifacts. So those things will always look sharp, but it's the fixed resolution stuff that will suffer. And that's not all of the harm that an unnecessarily high pixel density will do either. The high resolution graphics that are being rendered on screen take up more memory, so that 3 gigabytes of RAM really begins to feel more like 2, sometimes even 1.5. Plus the processor and GPU have to work harder to animate all those high resolution graphics, so it requires the device to put forth more effort just to get the same amount of work done. I know that Motorola wanted this thing's specifications to measure up to the competition, but this is really one area where they truly should not have taken the bait because the trade-offs just aren't worth it. Despite that, the Moto X's display panel provides 2 compelling reasons for the user to forgive this sin. Those include its sheer brightness output and the fact that it is LCD instead of LED. I know some people actually bitched about this in their 2015 reviews of the device, but I am absolutely thrilled that Motorola dropped LED in favor of LCD. After having personally been burned by Samsung and their Galaxy S Super AMOLED nonsense twice now, I told myself, never again. From the burn-in to the green tint to the unnatural color saturation that they apply in the software to perpetuate the myth of OLED's vibrance, I'd had about as much of that crap as one can handle, and apparently so did Motorola. The benchmarks say that this thing puts out a maximum of somewhere north of 700 nits of brightness, compared to my Galaxy Note's 200 some. The viewing angle is solid and the contrast is great, and I have the feeling that this screen is going to be a real winner. And for folks who like the oversaturated look, Motorola gives the user a choice right in the stock ROM. Leave the default checked for the punchy look, or switch to the natural option for a more lifelike vibrance. While we're on the topic of multimedia, I've got to talk about the speakers because they too represent a bit of a gamble taken by Motorola that paid off big. And here's why. Many devices stick with the speakers on the edges or more typically on the back because there just isn't enough room on the front of the handset where all the space is occupied by the screen, sensors, earpiece, front-facing camera, and navigation buttons. My Galaxy Note 2 was nice because it made very efficient use of its vertical space at the expense of the speaker being delegated to the back, although I excused it because it made up for its inadequacies there in the area of volume. The Pure takes a page from the HTC playbook and puts large stereo speakers right front and center. It takes up space, making the phone both very tall and lacking in the area of hardware buttons, but once you hear the sound output, I think you'll agree that it's totally worth it. The design isn't as clever and subtle as what we've seen on the HTC One, but it's not a bad look by any means. It does, however, share one of the One's design weaknesses, and that being that rubbish has a tendency to get caught in the speaker grills, which weren't designed with long-term durability in mind, and as such collect all kinds of debris. That's not too big of a deal though, because it's nothing that a few minutes and an old toothbrush can't fix. Do be careful with it though, as I have noticed that the embellishment on the left speaker of my Moto X has become a bit bent, and it's not uncommon to see these devices lose these parts altogether. A thick tempered glass screen protector may reduce the risk of snags. Next, I'd like to take a moment to talk about the design and ergonomics, because one of the biggest questions about the third Moto X is how Lenovo handled its highly touted pedigree in relation to the device's larger form factor. The two main things to know when it comes to this phone's form factor is that it is both a little narrower and a little taller than expected. In fact, the Pure Edition is actually narrower than my Note 2 even, which is interesting because the Note actually has a smaller screen, so there was clearly some serious attention paid to making the bezel as thin as physically possible. As mentioned earlier, the height comes from the bigger screen and larger speaker system. Bigger screen means disposable space for the on-screen buttons, so the user can still get the full 5.5-inch screen experience even with the seemingly wasted space. But the nice thing is that many video playing applications can make those navigation buttons go away completely while playing a video full screen. So it is at those times when the full and uncompromised 5.7-inch screen multimedia experience can be enjoyed. Now, while the phone is a bit thick at its deepest point, it once again adheres to the HTC school of design with a sloped backplane, which doesn't do it any favors when lying flat on a sturdy surface, but makes it quite comfortable to hold. And I don't think there's really a right answer to this. They could have just as easily made a flat design that doesn't wobble when it's laying down, although like so many other flat-back devices nowadays, it probably would have been a bit thicker or had a protruding camera lens, so even then the tabletop experience wouldn't have been that great. But this doesn't bother me that much, and one can't talk about the Pure Edition's design without taking a look at the use of materials. The back panel is a rubbery vinyl-like surface by default, although it could be special ordered in other finishes. I actually quite like the plain design because it gives the phone some badly needed grip, but unfortunately it's still not enough for me. So I've opted to go with a protective sleeve regardless to ensure that the device stays in my hand or propped up against whatever surface I've chosen to prop it up against for media consumption. Also, like on my last device, the buttons are far too easy to activate without some kind of casing. So even though I would have liked to have been able to recommend this phone naked, I am unable to do so. Good try though, Motorola. The Pure Edition may be a standout device in a sea of junk, but it's not without its weaknesses. the biggest of which by far is its vibration notification feature. That's honestly how bad it is. It doesn't matter how one holds the phone, the motor is always that noisy. This isn't just bad, it's downright embarrassing. I wouldn't even expect this kind of racket out of a cheap prepaid phone from 2006, let alone a modern flagship device. Thankfully, I take most of my notifications now exclusively on Pebble, so I can silence that monstrosity, but even then, the software insists on rumbling the phone in response to all sorts of gestures and input, which would be nice if the vibration was a bit more discreet, but it's not, so I have disabled most of the vibration feedback on my Moto X. Some may also cry foul to this phone's lack of infrared blaster, HDMI connectivity, fingerprint scanner, and FM radio, and while it would be fair to point out that those are fun features to have, they really aren't all that necessary, so they're probably not going to be terribly missed by myself, or anyone else for that matter. And on the bright side, consider the weight savings, power savings, and reduction in complexity offered by this more conservative feature set. Back on the device, we find that the X gets itself into trouble yet again with another one of its spec stunts in trying to out-badass the other high-end phones. This time it's the camera. For the first time ever, the Moto X gets a halfway decent Sony camera module, but Motorola simply opted for the one with the absolute highest resolution, 21 megapixel, rather than a more modestly equipped unit that might have had better performance. The world will never know. What we do know is that even though each picture takes up an unnecessarily huge amount of the device's puny 16GB storage capacity, the end result is a bit better even than the already excellent pictures taken on my Note 2. The interesting thing, however, is that the more I use this camera, the more I have come to appreciate the added resolution. All of a sudden, there's a whole undiscovered world of detail in ordinary snapshots, and it's really not that bad, which I really wasn't expecting given how hard the mainstream reviewers hit this camera in their original reviews of it back in 2015. I mean, the Note 2 had one of the best smartphone cameras of all time when it was new, with wide-angle lenses, good dynamic range, and cutting-edge low-light performance. But this thing beats it handily in all lighting conditions and focuses extremely quickly to boot. Photos taken do show compression artifacts when zoomed in, but the images are very natural, with no artificial sharpening of any kind taking place like there was on the Samsung. Even video recording is phenomenal, with the only noteworthy drawback being that there's no way to turn off digital image stabilization. But since most people don't use a tripod with their smartphones to shoot video anyway, there's really very little reason to even need to turn it off at all. And while it would have been nice to have more choices for things like that in different resolutions, I've actually grown to like the camera application and picture-taking experience on the Moto X more than I thought that I would. Thankfully, the Pure Edition doesn't lose any of the cool proprietary features that make it a Moto X. The secondary voice and context coprocessors are all still there and provide all of the cool voice and motion-activated fun that no other device can. The Moto X sleeps with one eye and ear open. If the owner takes it out of his pocket, the phone kind of half wakes up right away. If it's on a sturdy surface and someone reaches for it, the same thing happens thanks to the additional infrared sensors that are unfortunately obviously visible on the black model and absolute eyesores on the white ones. What's worse is that one can even see the infrared light coming out of them when they're active, which really kind of ruins the illusion, but I consider it to be worth it. This is one phone where the software experience is actually somewhat unique, which is made possible by competent hardware. Of course, this means that third-party ROMs such as CyanogenMod will be unable to take advantage of these features unless extra code is written specifically for it, but the good news with the Pure Edition is that there's really not much need for CyanogenMod in the first place. For the first time ever, somebody has built a truly carrier-agnostic mobile device for the USA. thanks in part to the fact that the CDMA side of Sprint and Verizon phones is now activated using a SIM card, just like the LTE. This also means that there isn't a special version for Verizon or Sprint or AT&T with carrier splash screens and non-uninstallable apps. There's just one software build for one single solitary model, and while Motorola's implementation of Android is boring to say the least, it's par for the course and quite acceptable, honestly, even at worst. And if you don't like it, aftermarket support for this device is vibrant, with many excellent third-party ROMs of all different kinds available. Unlocking the bootloader and achieving root is a relatively frustration-free process, and after attaining root, many decide that there is actually little reason to carry on any further with obtaining a different ROM because the stock one isn't actually all that bad. I'll talk more on this and wireless radio performance though in part 2. The Moto X Pure Edition may carry a few hints of the early compromises of Lenovo's corruption of the Motorola product line, but it's still a smash hit. I mean, I spent hours researching dozens of different devices even after discovering this one, but they all fell short for one reason or another. Whether it was the screen, the sound quality, an absence of decent software, or even the lack of availability on Verizon, I always kept coming back to this one. There wasn't even ever really a top 5 or top 3. Heck, it almost wasn't even fair. The Moto X Pure Edition stands out in a league of its own and is the only mobile device that, at present, both meets all my criteria and isn't ridiculously expensive. I got a pretty good deal on this one for under $175, and my guess is that this phone will be easily attainable at that price point in a matter of months. The Pure Editions with 32 and 64 gigabytes of storage are generally between $25 and $75 more expensive than the current going rate of the 16 gigabyte base model, respectively. Even though that approaches the $200 ceiling of money that I'm willing to spend on a mobile device, I'm actually less hesitant to recommend spending more on it because the Pure Edition has what I would consider to be long-term value. Thanks to the solid hardware and impressive software support, I could easily see myself getting 3 years or more out of one of these, with the non-replaceable battery being the only thing that could potentially get in my way. Although by that point the prices on the Pure will have come down far enough that the cost to replace the whole device might not even be that much more than the cost of replacing the battery. Between that and the fact that there are a multitude of different design combinations of this device floating around, I'll still keep my eyes open for another unit with greater storage capacity and in black with either blue, red, or neon green accent highlights instead of the standard gray that my device is equipped with. But for now, I'm just going to enjoy this one and continue to work toward getting it ready to replace the Note 2 as my daily driver come March. Around then, or shortly thereafter, one can expect to see the conclusion to this review, in which I cover battery life, wireless network performance, and software and rooting in depth. If that date has already passed, check out the video description or the related content section for the link to that second part. And as always, thanks for watching.